What if the oldest myths on Earth aren't myths at all, but ninits from a meeting no one told you we were a part of? Picture this, not incessant chanting, but wet clay, a reed stylus, and a record minus keeper carefully noting who arrived from heaven to earth and what they did when they got here. The Sumerians, 5,000 years ago, didn't leave us vague spiritual poems about invisible forces in the sky. They left thousands of clay tablets naming the Anunnaki, describing them with the kind of specificity you'd use for government officials or colonial administrators. That's where the first shiver of cognitive dissonance creeps in, because they speak of these beings as physical presences with ranks, tasks, and family lines, not as hazy symbols of thunder or rain. And beneath all those details runs a quiet, unnerving thread, a promise that what came down once could come back. Imagine standing in a dim archive today, surrounded by tablets baked hard as stone under the Mesopotamian sun, each one a fragment of someone's job, someone's orders, someone's encounter. The official line says you're looking at mythology, cultural imagination, people explaining storms and harvest by turning nature into gods with personalities. But as you read the wedge-shaped signs, you don't find metaphors about fertility energy or archetypal sky minus father. You find named Anunnaki, with titles, jurisdictions, and a clear chain of command, as if this was a colonial administration running a distant outpost. You find references to those who from heaven to earth came, written not once by a lone visionary, but again and again by generations of administrators copying an accepted record. So before this ancient morning pulls you deeper, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe. But only if you're drawn to mysteries that make you question whether mythology is just misunderstood history. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this knowledge, but not to imagine this knowledge spreading across the world the same way those ancient scribes must have hoped their warnings would reach future generations who might understand what they weren't trying to preserve. Because the question we're walking into together is this: where the Sumerians worshipping cosmic archetypes, unsettling precision of a bureaucracy. Picture the desert heat, the smell of dust and baked earth, and a single tablet still half-minus buried. Its cuneiform science packed in tight rows like an ancient spreadsheet. When you wash the soil away, what emerges is nosa to a log so minus and minus and minus so of the Anunnaki. Did this so minus and minus so decreed that this city was assigned here, the task was assigned there. The language speaks of decrees, allocations, canons, terms that sound less like mystic revelation and more like administration. Mainstream archaeology tells you this is how pre-minus scientific people anthropomorphize the forces around them. But what if that explanation is just a modern story we tell ourselves to avoid staring into a more disturbing possibility? Because the more you look at the tablets, the more they feel like a paper trail. Consider this: myths in most cultures drift and mutate, changing with each storyteller, but the Sumerian references to the Anunnaki stay stubbornly consistent across cities and centuries. These beings have names, relationships, rivalries. One oversees this territory, another that domain. The way regional directors report back to a distant headquarters. The texts don't say the sky, which we imagine as a father. They say this specific being from this specific line descended and took up residence here. It's as if every city not only had a temple, but also a kind of branch office for a larger, unseen administration. And the more bureaucratic the language becomes, the more that word myth starts to feel like a label slapped on a filing cabinet no one wanted to open too carefully. Now ask yourself, if you were a record-minus keeper in a world where powerful, non-minus human administrators had once walked among your ancestors, how would you write about them? You wouldn't call them my inner psyche or a symbol for rank cycles. You'd list their titles, their family affiliations, the territories they controlled, because getting those details wrong could mean breaking protocol. The tablets treat the Anunnaki as a known quantity, the way we today might reference the board, the shareholders, the board, or central command without explaining who they are every time. What unsettles mainstream interpreters is that the Sumerians don't act like they're inventing these figures, they act like they're updating a long standing dossier. And buried inside those dossiers is a phrase that refuses to die. They came from the heavens, and they are expected to return. Imagine sitting at a clay table centuries after the first impressions were made, copying an older tablet that itself was copied from something older still. Your job is not to improvise, your job is to preserve. The wedge minus marks must match, the names must line up, the order of beings in the Anunnaki hierarchy has to be exactly right, because you're not telling a campfire story, you're maintaining a protocol. Mainstream scholarship calls this religious conservatism, but what if it's something closer to archival discipline, anxious precision born from the belief that these gods were once physically present and might check your work when they return? That's when the cognitive dissonance sharpens, because devotion that careful feels less like piety and more like compliance. Picture those tablets stacked, catalogued, and stored, a silent bureaucracy of clay. Each one is small, maybe the size of your palm, but together they create a vast administrative memory, a record of agreements, transgressions, and cosmic contracts. When they speak of the Anunnaki, they do so with a tone you'd use for high-ranking officials whose directives shape the fate of cities, not for intangible metaphors. They don't just honor them, they obey them, negotiate with them, sometimes even sue for mercy as if filing an appeal. And when a culture treats its gods like negotiable but terrifying superiors, you have to ask, are we reading mythology or colonial correspondence? Consider how often these texts tie the Anunnaki to very specific places, not just the sky or the beyond, but actual cities, structures, and cult centers. A particular being is said to descend to the city, reside in that sanctuary, occupy a defined space, the way an official might take up residence in a governor's palace. The descriptions are tangible. Doors, gates, courtyards, offerings delivered on a schedule, rituals that sound like protocol for receiving a superior officer. These aren't abstract inner journeys, they're appointments and procedures. And once you notice that, every myth about a divine visit starts to look uncomfortably like a report of an inspection tour. Now, you've probably been told that all ancient peoples personified nature, turning storms into stone gods and the sun into sun gods. But what if the Sumerian tablets aren't doing that at all? What if they're describing a group of non-human administrators who used natural forces as tools, not embodiments? When a text says an Anunnaki lord decrees fate or assigns destinies, it doesn't sound like thunder rumbling, it sounds like an order being issued from higher up the chain. Even their genealogies feel less like mythic family drama and more like a careful way to track rank and authority, the way dynasties or corporate families keep lineages tied to power. The difference seems small at first, but it shifts everything, because a god who is nature can never return, they're always here, while a being who came from heaven to earth can leave and come back. Picture this unsettling detail. The Sumerians didn't just say the Anunnaki once descended, they preserved the idea that their coming and going followed patterns, cycles, a rhythm written into the story of the world. You'll see hints of this in how they talk about ages, in how they structure time around great arrivals and departures, as though history itself is a schedule. That theme of presence, withdrawal, and promised return repeats the way a chorus repeats in a song, too persistent to ignore. To a modern reader, that sounds eerily like a colony that set up operations, completed part of its mission, and then stepped back, leaving behind administrators in clay instead of in flesh. And if that's what's encoded in these texts, then those tablets might be less about worship and more about documenting a long-term project. Consider the psychological weight of that for the people who lived under it. If your ancestors truly believed that powerful beings from the sky had engineered your world, assigned your rulers, and laid down your laws, every ritual would be less about devotion and more about compliance with a standing directive. The record minus keepers wouldn't dare blur the line between story and report, because to falsify a report for a superior who might one day reappear is dangerous. This would explain why, across thousands of tablets, The core structure of the Anunnaki hierarchy barely wavers, even as details of local cults shift and change. It would mean that faith in that world was inseparable from protocol to lying buried for millennia, the memory of the Anunnaki's physical presence fading into what we lazily call myth. By the time modern scholars dug them up, the framework they had to interpret them was already set. Gods are symbolic, myths are psychological. The idea of real visitors from the sky is fringe, so when they read those who from heaven to earth came, they automatically convert it into the sky gods and file it beside Us and Dodin in a comparative religion chart. But the Sumerians never used vague, romantic language about their deities. They used bureaucratic precision, recorded obligations, and stressed the reality of these beings in their daily life. Which raises a quiet but disturbing question. Are we mistranslating not the words, but the intent behind them? Picture a modern administrator handed a stack of these tablets, stripped of labels, told nothing of their origin. They'd recognize the structure immediately: names, officers, jurisdictions, responsibilities, occasional punishments for stepping out of line. It would read like the paperwork of a complex organization managing a territory with current, sometimes cruelty. Only then would you tell them, by the way. Mainstream scholars call this mythology. The look on their face would probably mirror the jolt you're feeling now. Consider how much effort it takes to maintain such a record across generations. We're not talking about a single poem, we're talking about a massive clay bureaucracy, thousands of entries deep, all circling back to the central cast of Anunnaki figures. To keep that coherent record, minesweepers had to be trained, supervised, audited the way any serious administrative staff would be. They weren't improvising, they were replicating, making sure each title, each epithet, each relationship stayed aligned with a pre-existing template. That kind of long-tail information management feels much more like preserving a charter than echoing a fairy tale. Imagine this twist. The same culture that gives us these rich, painstaking records of the Anunnaki also insists that writing itself is a gift from them. The story isn't we poets dreamed up language in a haze of inspiration. It's this technology because writing is a technology because writing is a technology was handed down so we could keep track of decrees, offerings, and obligations. That story implies an origin where communication is not just expression, but instrument, a tool for enforcing order on a colony far from its overseers. In that light, every tablet is not just a religious artifact, but a device maintaining a connection to an absent administration. And if the absent administration is expected to return, those devices become something like a waiting room full of carefully filed reports. Consider this subtle but haunting point. The texts do not shy away from describing the Anunnaki as embodied, visible, and capable of direct interaction. They travel, they descend and ascend, they favor one city over another, they punish infractions. All things that suggest physical presence, not misty abstraction. To make sense of this, mainstream explanations often slip into metaphor, arguing that bodily action stood in for weather, fertility, or social ideals. But that requires assuming the Sumerians were incapable of saying, this is symbolic, even when they clearly distinguish between dreams, omens, and waking encounters. So the real question might be who is insisting these beings are metaphors the ancient record minesweepers or us. Picture a council hall in an ancient city, torches flickering, clay tablets laid out before a group of officials. On those tablets are records of previous visits, previous decrees from the Anunnaki, previous disasters that followed disobedience. When a new decision has to be made about war, building, the administrators don't just pray, they consult the record. See how similar situations were handled when the ones who from heaven to earth came were still tangibly involved. That's not how myth is usually used, that's how precedent is used in a legal or colonial context. Which hints that these stories for then were less about meaning and more about compliance with a remembered occupation. Consider the phrase promise to return and what it would do to a civilization's psychology. If your gods are nature itself, they can't return there, always present in every storm and sunrise. But if your gods are once minus present, now minus absent administrators, then history becomes a waiting room, rituals become status reports, and time is measured not just in seasons but in eras between inspections. The tablets hint at this worldview where the Anunnaki haven't simply vanished into metaphor, they've stepped back, leaving protocols in their wake. That's an entirely different cosmology from nature worship. It's a post-minus occupation society maintaining the files in case the supervisors come back. Imagine, too, how errors would be treated in such a system. If a record minus keeper miscopied a decree or misplaced a title, they wouldn't just be getting the story wrong, they'd be falsifying the archive of beings who once walked among their ancestors. That risk would make every stylus stroke an act of both fear and duty. This is why the precision in these texts feels haunting. They weren't just proud of their tradition, they were terrified of misrepresenting an entity that might, someday, stand over their clay tables again. When a myth starts to feel like a compliance manual, maybe it's time to question the label. Picture this: buried among the stories are references to powerful objects and systems like the knee and the Tablet of Destinies, that are treated not as metaphors but as concrete, transferable things that affect who holds authority. We'll dive deeper into those later, but note the pattern already. Power is bound up not just in beings, but in devices and documents, just as in any advanced bureaucracy. To gain or lose one of these items is to gain or lose control over entire domains, as if technology and paperwork themselves were levers of reality. That's not how most cultures talk about dreamlike spiritual power. That's how administrators talk about access, permissions, and keys. And if the Anunnaki are the ones who set up those systems, what does that say about the nature of their divinity? Consider how the phrase "those who from heaven to earth came" would sound if we heard it fresh, without centuries of interpretive baggage. If this line appeared in a modern Leno or a science fiction report, no one would insist it meant the abstract personification of the sky's fertility energies. When he writ as a description of transit, of movement from one domain to another, of beings crossing a boundary with purpose. The Sumerians repeat that phrase with a kind of matter minus fact clarity, as if they expect everyone to understand it. The only ones twisting themselves into knots to avoid its plain meaning are us. Now imagine zooming out thousands of such tablets scattered across cities, periods and dynasties, all harmonizing on the central cast of Anunnaki figures. The consistency is eerie, like picking up corporate documents from different branches worldwide and finding the same board members referenced in each. If these were purely invented myths, evolving orally, would expect wild variations, clashing genealogies, and radical reinterpretations. Instead, we get a relatively stable hierarchy, with disagreements more about emphasis than about core identities. That level of coherence hints at an original template everyone was trying very hard not to deviate from. Picture a culture where children grow up not just hearing "once upon a time the gods did X," but learning "this administrator oversees that function, this being decreed, our city est atis, this lineage granted us our place." Your origin story isn't about a distant, abstract creator, it's about a group of visiting powers who reorganized your world and assigned you your role. That's a fundamentally different way of organizing meaning. It feels less like religion as we imagine it, and more like living under the afterimage of an occupation. And if that's the case, then these tablets might be the only surviving paperwork from an ancient contact event. Consider how this shifts your relationship to the word God. For the Sumerians, the Anunnaki could be worshipped, feared, petitioned, but they were also, unmistakably, administrators who once walked the earth. Their divinity didn't make them intangible, it made them powerful, dangerous, and in some accounts, deeply fallible. They made decisions, sometimes terrible ones. They argued. They punished. They promised, all of which sounds less like distant cosmic principles and more like a ruling class with better technology and a longer plan. Imagine yourself now, in the quiet of your room, listening to all this under the same sky those ancient people stared at. We've given their stories comfortable labels: myth, legend, religious imagination, labels that create distance and, in a way, protect us from the unsettling possibility that they were trying to tell us something precise. They insisted their Anunnaki were real, embodied, hierarchical, and on a timetable that included departure and return. We insist they were mistaken, or poetic, or primitive. That clash between their certainty and our dismissal is where the real mystery begins to tighten its grip. Picture the clay tablets again, their surfaces crisscrossed with tiny wedges, each impression the frozen lotion of a human hand trying, desperately, to capture reality in a durable medium. That medium survives when almost everything else decays, so what we're left holding today is not their pottery, not their textiles, but their memory of the beings who from heaven to earth came. These memories were expensive to produce, costly in time and effort, and yet they chose to spend that cost on detailed descriptions of the Anunnaki and their roles. No one invests that much labor into preserving what they think is just a symbolic metaphor. And that's where the tablets start to feel less like mythology and more like an ancient, uninvited briefing. Consider this final question for now. If the Sumerians were indeed describing real visitors, call them ancient aliens, advanced humans, or something else entirely, would their records look any different from what we say? You would expect thousands of tablets. You would expect named beings with clear roles, genealogies, and a remembered promise to return. You would expect a blend of awe, fear, obedience, and occasional bitterness. Exactly what we find when any population writes about an occupying power. What you would not expect is vague, free-minus floating symbolism and tellingly. That's the one thing these tablets on us never give us when they talk about the Anunnaki. So as we move deeper into this story, keep that cognitive dissonance alive, a culture that believed it was documenting reality, and a modern world that insists it must have been dreaming. Because somewhere between those two certainties lies a third possibility, one that recasts the Anunnaki not as distant gods, but as administrators of a planetary project we've barely begun to understand. And if that project was real, then the clay under our feet isn't just soil, it's the filing cabinet of an experiment whose authors left, promising one day to walk back through the door. The only question that remains is whether these tablets are the last pages of that report, or the last pages of that report, or the opening chapter. Picture this: the year is 1849, the ruins of Nineveh are choking with dust, and Austin Henry Layard is pulling plate tablets out of the earth-like files from a collapsed archive. Those tablets, over 30,000 of them from the library of Ashurban, Ipel alone, are not dreamy hymns but inventories, omens, legal cases, and long narratives about the Anunnaki written with unnerving precision. It's as if you walked into a ruined corporate headquarters and found the HR records, the engineering manuals, and the founding myths all carefully shelved together, buried under the Mesopotamian sun. The documentation survived even when the walls and statues crumbled. And inside that documentation is something even more disturbing than the names of those who from heaven to earth came. Consider the Sumerian King List, one of those texts that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain with a straight face. It calmly records rulers, cities, and links of reign, and before the Great Flood, it assigns some of those kings lifespans of tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation of a record manuscript was copied, those numbers meticulously, preserving the impossible figures without comment, as if their job was to transmit data, not edit it. You can call those spans symbolic, but the administrators who wrote them didn't flag them as allegory, they filed them as history. And that strange obedience to an inherited template shows up again in the ground beneath one particular city. Eridu, often called the first city, was rebuilt in the same spot over and over for roughly 1500 years, layer stacked on layer like a geological printout of human persistence. The texts say Eridu was Enka's city, a contact point where an Anunnaki administrator first established a kind of headquarters on Earth. Archaeologists build back its foundations and find a stubborn insistence on that location, as if some protocol demanded that the colony's original note never be fully abandoned. Taken together with the written claims, the dirt behaves as though it remembers an initial installation that had to be honored. And where there is an installation, You expect tools, devices, and systems to manage it. That's where the me step out of the realm of vague divine decrees and start to look eerily like portable technology. In several texts, they appear as a list of over 100 distinct powers, bundles of authority and function that can be conferred, withdrawn, or outright stolen between cities. When a city possesses certainty, it flourishes in specific domains. When those me are taken, the text doesn't say the people lose faith. It says the actual capacities vanish. Power is treated like a set of installed modules, more like software licenses or operating protocols than floating blessings. And if the me are the modular apps of this system, there is one device in the literature that behaves like its master picture. This a man in 1849, clothes grey with dust, prying curved fragments of clay out of a collapsed room that hasn't seen daylight for over 2,000 years. He doesn't yet know that this room will be called the Library of Ashurbanipal, or that more than 30 Zora tablets will come out of this single hold, each one a voice pressed into clay and baked hard as stone under the Mesopotamian sun. He only knows that the floor is littered with broken rectangles covered in tiny, repeating marks, like the filing system of a dead bureaucracy. Among those tens of thousands of fragments are the texts that talk about the Anunnaki calmly, routinely, as if their presence is just part of the daily paperwork of the universe. But what Layard stumbled into that year wasn't a treasure of myths, it was an archive of protocols. Consider this: mainstream archaeology often introduces this library to you as a kind of Bronze Age literature collection, a king's attempt to gather stories, omens, and teachings from across his world. That description is not wrong, but it hides something unsettling in its simplicity. Because when you look closely at the tablets that mention the Anunnaki, they don't read like campfire tales or dreamy hints. They read like memoranda, like copies of decrees, like summaries of meetings between ranked beings whose titles and functions are given with workmanlike specificity. There is a tone of administration, of accountability, of someone needing to get the details right because someone higher up might check the file. The question that creeps in is simple: why would myth need this level of bureaucratic precision? Imagine kneeling on that ancient floor beside Layard, brushing dirt away from a tablet that snapped in half like a broken brick. On one side you make out a column of repeating signs, names, ranks, relationships laid out in an orderly sequence, as if someone were building a personnel roster for a colonial outpost. A few tablets later, you find a narrative that opens with a formulaic date line, situates an event in relation to an earlier decree, and then proceeds step by step through the actions of higher minus ranking and lower minus ranking in the Anunnaki, like minutes from the meeting. The mood isn't once upon a time. It's on this occasion, this is what was decided. You start to feel less like you're rereading a myth and more like you've walked into the records room of a lost administration. What makes this library so disturbing for a careful reader is not only its size but its intentionality. Over 30 Zoro tablets did not just happen to pile up in one place. Someone, or a chain of summons, decided that these texts, all of them, from the smallest fragment to the largest multi-minus column slab, needed to be gathered, copied, and stored together. Among them are texts that track offerings, list rituals, and record genealogies of the Anunnaki with the same dry tone that other tablets use to track deliveries of grain, the same system of marks, the same structured layout, the same habits of precision apply whether the subject is a shipment, a ceremony, or a decision made by those who from heaven to earth came. When you see that, the line between spiritual and logistical begins to blur in a very uncomfortable way. Now, think about the mindset of the record minus keepers who filled this library. These were not casual storytellers improvising around a fire. They were trained administrators, documentarians of a palace system that cared deeply about correct copying and exact wording. Tablet ends with formulas noting that it is a faithful copy of an earlier text, that it has been checked, that it matches the master, even when the content involves the Anunnaki deciding the fate of cities or humans. That concern for textual fidelity is not what you expect if these were merely symbolic tales meant to make people feel better about the mysteries of life. It's what you expect from a bureaucracy trying to preserve a usable archive of precedent and protocol. Picture the library as shelves, or what is left of them as a stratified memory. Each tablet another layer of institutional recall. You have routines, you have checklists, and in the same system, with no difference in style or seriousness, you have descriptions of Anunnaki envoys, their votes, their punishments, and their plans. It's as though the presence of these beings in the cosmic hierarchy is simply another fact to be logged, like tax payments or building materials. Mainstream archaeology struggles to explain why the record of gods in this environment is so painstaking and prosaic instead of abstract and poetic. The uneasy thought is that maybe, to these administrators, the Anunnaki weren't abstractions at all. Consider this counter-minus intuitive pivot. What if the real myths are our assumptions about what ancient texts are supposed to be, not the texts themselves? Were it vain to think that anything involving beings from the sky must be metaphor, that personified storm clouds and fertility spirits are just our ancestors trying to dress up natural forces? Yet in this library, the language that describes the Anunnaki is not the language of storms and seasons, it is the language of officers, jurisdictions, and chain of command. Titles are repeated across tablets and across entries, functions are specified, and even rivalries are framed in terms of access, authorization, and violations of agreed protocols. If that's mythology, it's a mythology wearing the mask of management. Imagine pulling out one tablet at random, its edges flaked, its surface uneven, but its rows of signs still remarkably crisp. You recognize from earlier study that it comes from a text composed centuries before the library was assembled, yet every sign is in its correct place. Every name and epithet of an Anunnaki administrator copied with unyielding loyalty to the template. The record-minus keeper who pressed these signs had no room for creative reinterpretation. His job, clearly, was to transmit. When that happens not once, but hundreds of times across different tablets and generations, you are confronted with the reality that for them, the existence and hierarchy of the Anunnaki were not up for debate. They were as accepted as the existence of the king whose seal authorized the copying. This is where the consistency across millennia becomes hard to shrug off. If you had one isolated story about sky-minus beings, you could comfortably label it and move on. But what do you do with a system in which those beings appear in contracts, in oaths, in ceremonial descriptions, and in historical summaries with the same set of names on relationships? The way the texts invoke them doesn't change the way metaphors usually evolve over time. There's no gradual drift into new characters, no radical reinterpretations that break continuity. The Anunnaki hierarchy is treated like a stable backdrop, a given, a framework within which human events unfold. It's as if, from the perspective of the scribal class, the Anunnaki were as real as the bricks in the walls. Picture this unsettling scene: a record-minus keeper in 1 century is copying a text that describes the founding of a city by a named Anunnaki administrator several centuries later. Another record-minus keeper is copying a legal document that uses that same Anunnaki name as a guarantor of the agreement's sanctity. Different kinds of text, different purposes, same celestial official. That's not how one-minus of myths behave, that's how enduring institutions behave, embedded into the language and thought of a culture so deeply that no one feels the need to explain them. The Library of Ashurban doesn't read like a curated collection of inspiring legends. It reads like a snapshot of a civilization that had long since normalized a particular story about who ran the cosmos. Now consider the style of the Anunnaki narratives themselves as preserved in this library. They often begin with formulaic openings, situating the action in a particular cosmic or historical context, much the way modern meeting minutes begin with a date, a location, and a list of attendees. Key decisions are described in direct, unemotional language. A decree is issued, a punishment is decided, a favor is granted, a technology then is transferred, and the effect on cities or humans is noted. The tone is disturbingly procedural, like someone writing a case file rather than a sermon. If this were purely religious storytelling, you would expect more emotional flourish, more exaltation. Instead, you get the cold comfort of a well-organized report. Imagine too, what it means that the same Anunnaki-related texts appear not just in this one library, but in copies known to have been made in earlier periods, which then get recopied here with very little modification. That's the consistency mainstream archaeology has to wrestle with and expected. A body of content that endures, relatively stable through political upheavals and cultural shifts. It suggests that, whatever else was changing in their world, the underlying picture of who the Anunnaki were, what they did, and how they were structured remained stable enough to warrant exact preservation. The record miners keepers did not treat these as fairy tales that evolve with fashion. They treated them like legal precedents, and precedents by nature are based on something that once happened. Consider this counter-intuitive question. If the Anunnaki were only symbolic stories about natural forces, why go to such pains to standardize their names, their ranks, and even the order in which they were listed? Nature doesn't care if you rearrange its metaphors, yet in these tablets order matters. The list of who stands above whom, who has authority over which domain, is handled with the same rigidity you'd expect in a colonial chain of minuscule chart. You don't get improvisation, you get replication. Something about this structure was important enough that deviation could not be tolerated, and that tells you that, to the mind preserving it, the Anunnaki system was more than a convenient teaching tool. Picture an administrator in this ancient world, tasked not with entertaining the masses but with ensuring that rituals, oaths, and state decisions align with the correct celestial hierarchy. For him, these tablets in the library are reference material, not bedtime stories. When a question arises, what offering corresponds to which Anunnaki official, what protocol governs a particular plea or punishment, he doesn't make it up, he consults the documentation. That is the flavor the texts convey. They hit your mind, not as wild speculation, but as the dry, firm language of a world that believed itself to be embedded in an already defined cosmic bureaucracy. Once you feel that, the label mythology starts to feel thin. Now think about the way this library functions as a bridge, tying together different centuries of memory into one institutional bundle. The record keepers who served the king who owned this archive were inheriting not only the stories, but the protocols of prior Mesopotamian centers that had themselves stored and transmitted similar texts. By the time all of this was pulled into the library of Ashurbanipal, the Anunnaki related documents had behind them a long life of copying, reciting, and applying, yet there is no sense, in the final versions we have, that their authority has decreased or that anyone is treating them as quaint. On the contrary, their placement in the Royal Library seems to crown them, to fix them firmly as the official cosmic reference of a world power. Imagine running your fingers lightly over the surface of one of these tablets, feeling the shallow but precise indentations made by a stylus and wet-lace entries before it was dried. Every mark was a decision. Every mark had to conform to an agreed system, and every mark was part of a chain of transmission reaching back to sources the record keeper would never have seen. He knew only that he was reproducing something authoritative. When the subject is grain rations, that authority is logistical. When the subject is the Anunnaki Council deciding to alter the fate of humankind, that authority takes on a different weight. The anxiety that creeps in is this: did they think they were preserving fiction, or were they convinced they were preserving a record of actual interactions? Consider, too, that these texts do not apologize for their content. They do not begin with disclaimers like "this is but a story to illustrate a moral," the way later allegorical traditions sometimes do. Instead, they present events involving the Anunnaki with the same straightforwardness that they used to present events involving kings and cities. The presence of these beings is not argued for, it is presupposes. That presupposition, maintained across millennia of copying, suggests that either an astonishingly resilient metaphor was at work, or that a deeply held memory whether accurate or distorted, was being guarded with unusual care. The library embodies that guarded memory in baked clay. Picture this: you pull one tablet from the pile, and it records a dispute among Anunnaki officials, complete with a deliberation and a final decision, phrased in clear, administrative language. The next tablet you examine lists offerings and rituals against record like a set of standing operating procedures. Both are part of the same world, a world where divine and bureaucratic language share the same syntax. That blending should give you pause because it dissolves the boundary between the heavenly and the administrative, between God and governor. In that dissolution, you can feel the outline of a colonial mindset, one in which higher authorities from heaven run the show the way distant overseers run a province. Now, ask yourself why a colonial bureaucracy would keep such records. If you were managing a distant outpost with local populations to oversee and resources to extract, you do want documentation of decisions, procedures and precedents. You'd want a library that later administrators could consult to avoid repeating mistakes, to justify actions, to ensure continuity. Strangely, that is exactly what the library of Ashurbanipal feels like in many respects, an attempt by a terrestrial king to collect not only human knowledge, but the paperwork of a cosmic administration. Whether or not that cosmic administration ever existed, as the texts describe, the belief in it was strong enough to be logged, filed, and centralized. Imagine looking over the shoulder of a record minus keeper in that library, as he checks a copy HES just made against an older tablet. He reads each sign aloud, traces it with his stylus, confirms that the order of the Anunnaki names, the sequence of events, and the embedded decrees match exactly. Any variation must be corrected. The integrity of the chain depends on his diligence. When he finishes, he adds a note indicating that this is a verified copy of a reliable source, then hands it over to be stored among the 30,000 others. What he has just done is treat information about beings from heaven with the same standard of proof and accuracy that we today reserve for legal and scientific texts. Consider this counter-intuitive twist. Maybe the library's very existence is itself a kind of evidence, not that the Anunnaki were necessarily real in the way the texts say, but that the people preserving these texts believed they were handling documentation, not parable. You can feel that in the absence of certain features, there is no encouragement in these tablets to interpret the stories as personal moral lessons. There is no consistent allegorical coding where one Anunnaki always stands for one natural force. Instead, they interact, argue, and specialize in ways that make more sense if they are treated as individuals within an organization. That organization might be imagined, might be mythic, might be based on something older and half-minus remembered, but its representation is systematic. Picture this unsettling detail. The same Anunnaki official who appears in a myth about the creation of humans might also appear in a text that deals with the regulation of rituals in a specific city. To a modern reader taught to divide genres sharply, that's a category mistake to the ancient administrators who compiled this library. It isn't. For them, cosmic and civic realities are part of a single integrated hierarchy, with the Anunnaki as upper-air managers. That seamless integration is precisely what makes the library such an important piece of evidence. It shows you a mindset in which divine colonizers and everyday governance are not separate topics. Now imagine the effect this would have on generation after generation of record-minus keepers. You're retrained into a world where your work copying, indexing, preserving is framed as participation in a larger cosmic order administered by these beings. Every tablet you handle that names an Anunnaki official reinforces not just religious belief, but professional duty. Getting the details right is part of maintaining alignment with that order. Across centuries, that creates a self-reinforcing loop. The more exactly the texts are copied, the more solid their content appears, and the more essential it becomes to copy them exactly. The library, then, is more than a pile of text. It is the physical residue of a long-term cognitive program. Consider the emotional texture of this for modern researchers who approach the library as skeptics. You're trained to read ancient texts critically, to separate myth from fact, to look for political motives and social functions. Then you encounter these tablets where beings like the Anunnaki are described with the same dry specificity as tax obligations. Something in you pulls back. This cannot be literal, you tell yourself, because our framework won't allow it to be. Yet the more you catalogue, the more you notice the consistency, the relentlessly matter minus of minus fact attitude toward entities we've labeled gods. The dichotomy between our categories and theirs becomes a source not of clarity, but of cognitive dissonance. Picture this too. You spread copies of these tablets across a table, arranging them not by modern thematic labels like myth or ritual, but by the names of the Anunnaki officials they mention. Suddenly, patterns emerge. Certain names cluster around particular types of decisions, particular kinds of technology, such as the me or that elusive master device we call the Tablet of Destinies. Others appear briefly, in sharply defined roles, then vanish. It looks less like random storytelling and more like a personnel map, a record of who held which portfolio in a complex cosmic administration. Now think about the implications of that for the broader question that haunts this entire topic. Are we looking at gods or visitors? Theology on this understood history. The Library of Ashurban-Apel, with its more than 30,000 tablets, doesn't answer that question directly. Clay can't testify to what really descended from the sky. What it does show, beyond reasonable dispute, is a civilization that institutionalized its understanding of the Anunnaki into a stable, transmissible framework was based on encounters, on visions, on inherited legends of an earlier age, or on some mixture of all three. It was not treated as optional. The very ordinariness of the language is what makes it extraordinary evidence. Imagine further, this library is not unique in spirit, even if it is monumental in scale. It is the culmination of earlier archives, earlier collections, earlier traditions of copying and preserving. That means the consistency of Anunnaki descriptions across millennia is not accidental. It's the result of sustained, organized effort. Someone wanted these names, these hierarchies, these decisions to last. Someone believed that future administrators, whether human or otherwise, might need to consult them. The library, in that sense, feels eerily like a briefing packet left on a desk in a command center that's been evacuated. Consider this counter-minus intuitive angle. What if, instead of asking, did the Anunnaki really exist as described, we ask, what kind of phenomenon could produce this sort of long term, bureaucratically maintained memory? One possibility is a purely mythic system so useful for organizing society that it had to be preserved with legal precision. Another is a distorted echo of real encounters with non-human administrators whose impact was so profound that it fossilized into administrative law. The library cannot tell us which is correct, but it forces us to move beyond simplistic dismissals. When stories get copied like legal codes, they stop being just stories. Picture yourself back with Laird in 1849 as he watches crates of tablets being hauled out of the ruins and packed for transport. He doesn't yet know how many there are, that the final count will be over 30,000 pieces, each one a puzzle fragment of a larger worldview. He certainly doesn't know that among them are some of the most detailed surviving records of the Anunnaki bureaucracy, lying side by side with texts about kings, wars, and economies. What he has uncovered, without realizing it, is not just a library, but a snapshot of how an entire civilization thought about its place in a layered, colonized cosmos. The shock comes later, when scholars read these texts and realize how matter minus of minus fact the colonizer's presence seems to be. Now we stand, generations of researchers later, still wrestling with the same problem those first translators faced. The facts about the library are straightforward. Discovered in 1849 by Austin Henry Laird, holding more than 30,000 clay tablets that together form one of the richest archives of ancient Mesopotamian thought. The facts about the Anunnaki within that archive are also straightforward. They are described with bureaucratic precision, treated as a governing hierarchy, and mentioned across centuries of copies as if their existence were simply part of the furniture of reality. What we do with those facts how we interpret the gap between our categories and theirs, is where the mystery opens. And in that gap, other artifacts and other anomalies begin to line up in disquieting ways. Picture this: you step away from Ashurban, Ipel's shelves, and into the wider landscape of Mesopotamian finds, still holding in your hands the habit of reading gods as administrators. Suddenly, other tablets you once filed under myth start to look uncomfortably similar in tone and texture. A king list scratched into dark clay, its wedge mark still catching dust, reads less like legend and more like a dynastic register that simply refuses to respect human lifespan. A flood narrative once treated as moral allegory now feels like a crisis report circulating through the same chain of command that fills the library at shelves. Once you've seen the Anunnaki framed as officials, it becomes very hard to unsee that frame elsewhere. And this is where the pattern sharpens into something you can't dismiss as coincidence. Those impossible reign lengths, that obsessively revered city of Eridu, those portable me that behave more like checkout-able devices than vague blessings, the Tablet of Destinies treated as a single catastrophic point of failure. Each of these comes to you on clay, just as dry, just as bureaucratic, as anything in Ashurban Ipel's archive. The style matches, the mindset matches, the quiet assumption of a colonized cosmos matches. What changes is that now the content begins to push directly against what we think we know about time, technology, and biology, and biology, and biology, and biology into specific artifacts that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. Picture this: Yori in a silent back room, a single low lamp, and on the table in front of you is a clay tablet, cracked at the edges, baked hard as stone under a Mesopotamian sun that set 5,000 years ago. The wedge marks are cramped and meticulous, line after line of names and numbers pressed into the clay with a precision that feels less like poetry and more like an accountant obsessing over a ledger. This is the Sumerian King List, and across its surface, it calmly informs you that before the flood, kings reigned not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. No metaphors flagged, no as if language, just an unbroken register copied over and over by generations of record-keepers who treated these lifespans as part of the bureaucratic fabric of their world. The unsettling part is not just the numbers, it's the way nobody in the text seems to think those numbers need explaining. And that quiet confidence forces you to ask what kind of history they believed they were preserving. Imagine being the administrator tasked with copying this document, your reed stylus dragging through wet clay as you carefully enter one more impossible figure: 30,000 years, 40,000 years, 40,000 years, 40,000 years, and you don't round it, you don't adjust it, you don't comment. You just copy it, faithfully, because the protocol says you copy what was handed to you, even if it makes no sense by human standards of biology. Mainstream archaeology will tell you this is mythic time, symbolic grandeur, lifespan stretched to signal importance rather than literal duration. But what if that explanation is more about our need to feel safe than about what the text is actually doing? What if, to the record-keepers, these absurd reigns were simply the operational timelines of a different class of beings, administrators whose cycles ran on scales we can't inhabit? The fact that they kept this list in circulation for centuries without editing out the impossibility is the first crack in the it's all metaphor story. What scholars rarely discuss openly is how stubborn that list is, how it refuses to bend towards realism even as late as, through more rational ages. You'd expect a scribe somewhere along the line to normalize the data, to shrink those lifespans into something that fits the human frame, especially once empires changed and new ideologies took power. Instead, the list is copied like a legal document, each reign preserved with almost cruel specificity, as if tampering with the numbers would violate some higher administrative order. This is what creates that cognitive dissonance. The tone of the writing says minutes from a meeting, but the content says time frames from another reality. When you treat the tablet as a bureaucratic artifact instead of a bedtime story, the anomaly stops being cute and starts being structural. And that structural strangeness only deepens when you look at the ground those kings supposedly ruled from. Picture the southern Mesopotamian plain, flat, dusty, almost featureless, except for a low mound of eroded brick and broken pottery cutting a faint silhouette against the horizon. That mound is all that remains of Eridu, a city that the text consistently tied to Enki, the Anunnaki figure associated with deep wisdom water, and the underground lane. Archaeology tells us something quietly astonishing here. Eridu was just built once and abandoned. It was rebuilt on the same spot for roughly 1500 years, layer upon layer of mud, brick and plaster, as though some invisible line on the ground could not be moved. The stories say this was Ank's contact point, his chosen locus on Earth, and the people who lived there behaved as if they took that literally, returning to the same coordinates, even when rebuilding from ruins would have been far harder than starting fresh a short walk away. This obsessive loyalty to one exact place suggests something more like adherence to an non-negotiable site protocol than mere nostalgia. Consider this. In a normal human settlement pattern, cities drift, expand, contract, and sometimes shift entirely as rivers move, trade routes change, and power centers realign. But in Eridu, generation after generation chose to scrape away or build atop the old foundations, as if some unseen contract demanded continuity of that single footprint. To the mainstream view, this is framed as religious devotion. The sacred prestige of an origin city clung to long after its practical value waned. Yet the stories that call Eridu Nk is contact point make that devotion feel eerily like an obligation to maintain access to a fixed node pad, a gate, a terminal that had to remain available should higher ranking administrators from heaven to earth require it. What chills you is the way the archaeological habitat and the mythic claim reinforce each other: a stubborn site in the dirt and a stubborn idea in the text, both pointing to a place that mattered beyond human politics. And from that fixed node, the documents say, something even stranger began to circulate. Imagine the same record minus keepers, but now instead of lifespans, they're cataloging something far more intangible, and yet they treat it as if it can be checked and undoubt like equipment. In texts tied to Enki and his city, we find lists of items called the Me, over 100 of them, each line naming a different divine power or function: kingship, wisdom, crafts, music, warfare, social order. On the surface, scholars translate these as cultural institutions, the element that makes civilization possible, granted by a god to humanity. But the stories don't talk about them like abstractions. They talk about them as portable, countable items that can be held, transferred, and stolen. The clay that preserves these lists is as rough and real as any warehouse inventory tablet, yet what it describes sounds like civilization packaged into discrete modules. Picture this in one well-minus no narrative often called an Anunnaki. A younger, ambitious figure arrives in Enk's city, shares drink with him, and then departs not just with blessings but with a cargo of me loaded, line by line, onto her boat. The text doesn't say she inspired people to adopt new ideas. It says she physically took the me and brought them to her own city, causing it to flourish with new powers it did not have before, realizes what has happened, and dispatches agents to pursue and reclaim the stolen items, but as contraband technology that has slipped from one jurisdiction to another. That is not how you tell a story about allegories drifting around in the collective unconscious. That is how you narrate a breach and access control over portable assets. And once you notice that, the me start to look less like virtues and more like installable functions in a distributed system. Consider how unsettling that is if you take the tablet at its own tone. We're looking at a civilization that not only believed its core institutions came from elsewhere, but also imagined those institutions as things that could be boxed up, shipped, and redeployed across the network of cities. It reads disturbingly like the way a corporation would handle software licenses, manufacturing protocols, or administrative charters. Assets that belong to headquarters and are granted or revoked according to internal politics. What if those over 100 me were the way a colonizing presence conceptualized its civilization kit? A set of standardized packages it could drop into human settlements to bootstrap them into usefulness. The myths about them being stolen, fought over, or jealously guarded become less about divine jealousy and more about control over who gets to run which programs on the human colony. And that framework casts an eerie light back onto places like Eridu, where one contact point might have been the original deployment site for the entire kit. What makes mainstream archaeology struggle to explain this cleanly is the mismatch between how the me are listed and how we expect ancient people to talk about culture. If you and I were inventing myths about wisdom or law, we might personify them, dramatize them, wrap them in metaphor, but these texts keep returning to enumeration, to structured lists, to the logistics of transfer. The record minus keepers are not painting a mural, they're maintaining a catalogue. Even the numbers, over 100, suggest a finite plan set, not an open, ever-minus growing field of human invention. It is as though someone somewhere had a checklist of everything a functioning urban colony was supposed to have, and they were very interested in tracking who had access to which items at any given time. And if the me are modules, then somewhere there has to be a master key. Picture this again in modern terms. You can distribute software all you like, but somewhere a central authority controls the root credentials that tell the system what is allowed to happen at the deepest level. In the Mesopotamian stories, that role is played by something called the Tablet of Destinies, a single physical object, not a metaphorical book of fate, whose possession determines who has the right to govern the cosmos. When a high-ranking administrator of the Anunnaki holds it, order prevails. When it is stolen, the text says, the structure of reality itself becomes unstable, as if some master configuration file has been tampered with. The descriptions emphasize not just its symbolic importance, but the panic and emergency measures that follow its theft, which reads more like a security breach incident report than a fairy tale. The idea that all levels of heaven and earth could be contingent on a single artifact is terrifying enough. The way they treat it like a piece of vulnerable hardware makes it worse. Imagine being one of those administrators watching as a rival or subordinate makes off with the Tablet of Destinies, knowing that as long as they hold it, your authority and your carefully managed colony are at risk. The stories describe attempts to recover it, not through philosophical argument, but through direct operations. Confrontations, retrieval missions, a focused push to get the object back into the right hands. If this were pure metaphor, why hinge the entire cosmic order on one theft, one physical item, instead of on divine will or inherent morality? It feels like we're reading a dramatized memory of a system where power really was concentrated in a single point of failure, a device or control load whose loss could cascade through every layer of the hierarchy. The Tablet of Destinies, then, becomes the ultimate technological anchor in these myths, the root admin key in a universe imagined as a managed network. And here's where the unease begins to accumulate. We now have multiple artifacts and narratives, king lists, the Tablet of Destinies, all behaving like components of a managed system, not scattered religious symbols. The King List preserves timelines that fit beings far beyond human cycles. Eridu obsesses over one fixed contact point. The me circulate as portable modules. The Tablet of Destinies functions as a master override. Each of these could be dismissed in isolation, but together they start to look like a technical diagram sketched in mythic language. It's as though the record minus keepers were trying to describe a massively complex infrastructure using the tools their culture had, encoding an operating manual in the only narrative format available to them. The question that remains is why such a system would ever need something as drastic as a global reset. Now we come to a story that nearly everyone has heard in some form, yet very few people realize how differently it appears on these clay tablets. In the text we call the Atrahasis epic. There is a flood, yes, but it's not framed as a purely moral judgment on human wickedness. Instead, it reads like a population control decision, a crisis in resource management among the Anunnaki administrators, who are described as increasingly burdened and disturbed by the noise and growth of humanity. They convene, deliberate, and ultimately authorize a drastic reduction, a reset that will wipe out almost all of their engineered workforce. It's a chilling way to tell the story of the flood, not as a divine tantrum, but as an executive memo about culling a runaway project. And into that memo, one dissenting voice quietly inserts a survival protocol. Picture this: Atrahasis, the designated survivor, receives not a vague hint but detailed instructions from Enki, the same figure tied to Eridu, about how to construct a vessel that can withstand what is coming. The text emphasizes engineering specificity, measurements, structural guidance, clear directions down to the logistics of sealing and loading, as if someone is reading out blueprints to an untrained but obedient foreman. This is not the language of mythic symbolism, it is the language of a design brief, preserving the no-hand needed to ride out a planned catastrophe. The flood itself becomes less the centerpiece and more the environmental condition around a very focused technological act, the building of a survivable craft to preserve a seed population. You can almost feel the stylus pressing harder into the clay as the record-keeper tries to capture each instruction without error. Consider how different that is from a moral parable where the important part is repentance and grace. In Atrahasis, the human protagonist survives because he has access to privileged information from within the administration, and that information takes the form of technical specifications, not generic reassurance. Enki is portrayed as subverting a top-down population order by slipping a single human the manual for a lifeboat, using the very bureaucratic mindset of the system to undermine its ultimate decision. Again, if we momentarily entertain the documentation lens, this looks like a carefully preserved record of a whistleblower event inside a colonial hierarchy, one in which official policy and individual ethics collided. The art in that frame is less a symbol of faith and more a piece of emergency engineering carried out under extreme time pressure. What makes this especially haunting is how it reframes the flood itself. If the Anunnaki are administrators of an engineered species, then the flood isn't an act of blind rage, it's a controlled burn, a way to reset a population whose growth lifespan or behavior has exceeded tolerances. The Atrahasis text even hints at cycles, earlier measures before the flood, then the final, drastic step echoing the way a system might escalate through stages of intervention before rebouting. To a society that remembered this event only in human terms, it would feel like unforgivable divine cruelty to the administrators authorizing it. It might have been a grim maintenance operation. The record-keepers, stuck between both perspectives, did the only thing they knew how to do. They wrote it all down as precisely as possible. Picture a clay tablet, edges worn, script still sharp where the stylus once bit into wet clay, detailing who survives, what animals are brought aboard, how long the waters raged underneath it all, the quiet admission that humanity exists because someone broke ranks. Enki's role links back to everything we've seen. His association with the Eridu as a contact point, his stewardship of the me, his involvement in the creation and preservation of humans as a usable yet problematic workforce. The Atrahasis epic sits in the same narrative ecosystem as the King List and the me text, all orbiting the same cluster of functions: creation, control, distribution of technology, and the threat of reset. When you put them side by side, they feel less like independent myths and more like different chapters in an internal case file, and somewhere above all of this, the Tablet of Destinies looms like the final authority that makes such decisions stick. Imagine the boardroom, -level version of these stories: a council of Anunnaki, each with defined portfolios, one of them holding the Tablet of Destinies as the alternate credential. They debate the human problem, some argue for preservation, others for reduction, and the one with the tablet has the power to ratify the outcome. If that tablet were ever to change hands in the midst of such crisis, you can feel how the entire plan could shift: policies revoked, decrees countermanded, destinies reprogrammed, the myths about its theft and recovery. Then, like be faint echoes of very real power struggles at the current level of this supposed colonial project, And viewed through that lens, the flood decision itself becomes part of a much larger saga about who gets to write and rewrite the rules of the game. What's disturbing is how all of this is delivered to us not in the voice of the powerful, but through the hands of the administrators and record minus keepers who sat much closer to the ground. They were the ones taking dictation, compiling lists, copying older tablets whose original contexts they might only half understand. When they carved the King List, they weren't debating whether a 30,000-year reign made sense. They were obeying a continuity protocol that demanded fidelity over interpretation. When they listed the me, they likely had no way to imagine downloading an app or updating firmware, yet they carefully preserved a logic of portable, transferable powers. They may not have grasped the full nature of the Tablet of Destinies, but they knew enough to recall that when it moved, everything shook. Consider the emotional texture of that position you're living in a world that, on one hand, is intensely material mud brick walls, reed boats on slow rivers, grain rations carefully tallied on clay, and on the other, is haunted by a hierarchy of beings whose lifespans, technologies, and decisions operate far above your comprehension. You are told that your city stands where it stands because an unseen contact point was chosen long before you were born, and your job is to maintain the continuity of that choice. You're instructed that the powers animating your institutions were once bestowed in discrete packages and could, in theory, be revoked. You hear rumors that the cosmic order itself depends on a single object being held securely in the right hands. And then, one day, the floodwaters come, and only the story of how a single man survived reaches you in the form of a dictated report. Picture those record minus keepers, years or even centuries later, sitting in the light of oil lamps, reconstructing these narratives from older tablets and fading oral accounts, their own reality already feeling distant from the cataclysms they describe. To them, the King List is ancient history, but the numbers are still sacred. Eridu may already be a ruin, but its status as ENK, its contact point, is non-negotiable tradition. The Nile have become ritual objects or symbols by their time, but their lists still frame them as countable entities with assigned owners. The flood is an ancestral trauma, but its engineering details are preserved with a care that suggests more than pious curiosity. It's as if some latent instruction keeps whispering, do not alter the files, do not simplify, just copy. What if those instructions were just cultural habits, but the afterglow of an imposed documentation standard, an ancient compliance regimen left behind by a colonizing presence that cared deeply about records? That would explain the dryness of tone, the obsession with sequence, duration, and enumeration across so many genres of text. The King List, the lists of me, the flood report in Atrahasis, the Tablet of Destinies narratives, they all share a fixation on who holds what power, for how long, and under what conditions it can be transferred or revoked. This is not the random myth minus making of a pre-minus scientific people. It has the flavor of administrative memory, half minus transformed into story but never fully released from its original frame. And once you start to see that, you begin to wonder what else in their corpus might be disguised procedural documentation. Imagine looking at these tablets not as isolated curiosities but as fragments of a single operating manual, scattered across time and genre. The King List tells you who has governed the system and for how long. The E or Eridu strata on the ground mark the coordinates of a crucial axis, point the me, enumerate the modules deployed into the human field. The Tablet of Destinies stories dramatize the central authority token. The Atrahasis epic records a catastrophic maintenance operation and the hack that preserved a subset of the user base. Taken together, they form a rough architecture diagram of a civilization that did not see itself as alone and did not see its own institutions as purely homegrown. Whether you accept the ancient minus visitor hypothesis or not, the coherence of that architecture is hard to ignore once you trace it across the clay. And yet, there is still one part of the system we haven't touched, the users themselves. Because if this really was a managed project, if the Anunnaki of the texts were administrators and engineers, rather than abstract deities, then the most unsettling question isn't about their tools, their contact points, or even their master tablet. It's about time that preserves the King List, and the Flood Report also contains narratives about how humans came to exist in the first place. And those texts are just as unavinging specific as everything we've seen so far. They describe processes, mixtures, and experiments, not spontaneous creation by fire. They speak of trial and error, of adjustments made to a newly formed species until it met the requirements of its sponsors, and they anchor this biological tinkering in the same network of cities, administrators, and cycles that we've been circling around. Picture this: the clay, the stylus, the crumped script, all the same, but the content shifts from who ruled and what was deployed to how the worker itself was assembled. The record minescapers don't switch to a different tone. They still sound like documentarians, not mystics, as they recount the mixing of clay with divine components, the deliberations over what the new being should be able to endure, how long it should live, how easily it should be controlled. In those lines, the Anunnaki looked less like gods issuing commands and more like technicians troubleshooting a prototype. The same Enki who manages contact points and subverts population linus control orders is there at the outset, offering solutions, proposing methods, guiding the process. And once again, mainstream archaeology labels this myth while the tablets stubbornly read like case notes. What makes this prospect so haunting is the way it closes the loop around everything we've discussed of the King List's impossible reigns. Eridu's stubborn footprint, the portable knee, the catastrophic flood, and the Tablet of Destinies all belong to a single operational framework. Then humanity itself might be one of the engineered components of that framework. The records don't just hint at this, they outline it with the same bureaucratic calm that they use for every other aspect of their world. Whether or not we accept that literally, the pattern is there, waiting to be confronted. And the administrators who once walked those ziggurat stairs did not only look down at us, they also looked up. The moment the text shift from kings and cities to flesh and bone, the tone doesn't soften into poetry, it tightens into procedure. In the Atrahasis epic, the origin of humanity is not a gentle metaphor about dust and breath, it is a sequence, a protocol, written with the same dry efficiency as a labor report. The record minescapers describe a meeting, a problem, too much work for the existing workforce, too much strain on the hierarchy of the Anunnaki, then a proposed solution: manufacture a new kind of worker. The way they describe that manufacture is where the line between myth and manual starts to blur, and from that blur, the path leads not just into our blood, but into the sky. Picture this: a dim, enclosed chamber, packed clay walls cool against the baking Mesopotamian heat outside. A low-oil lamp flickering as administrators debate what to do with a rebellious labor force. The Atrahasis text tells us that the answer is a new being made from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a sacrificed god named Wiminasila, a being whose essence is literally ground into the mixture. There isn't symbolic language about spirit or breath, it is disturbingly anatomical, stressing blood, flesh, and blending like a recipe that cannot be improvised. The clay, in their words, is not enough on its own, it must be activated, seeded, hybridized with something that belongs to the Anunnaki themselves. And once you see that specificity, you have to Myth would go to such lengths to describe a process no worshipper could ever perform, and then mankind was formed. It walks through trial and error, adjustment and correction, as if a team of technicians is troubleshooting a design. There are hints of failed attempts, of beings that are not quite right, of a process that needs refining before it stabilizes into the human as we know it. That language feels less like a priest chanting and more like an engineer taking notes between iterations, trying to document what works and what doesn't. It is the same bureaucratic calm we saw in the population minus control decrees test. Evaluate, revised, log, and once your mind frames it that way, the myth reads like a case file in an experiment whose subject is us. Consider this: mainstream readers are told that clay is just a metaphor for earth, for mortality, for our fragile connection to soil and nature. Yet the Atrahasis epic insists on combining the clay with very specific biological material, naming blood and flesh, naming the donor, naming blood and flesh, naming the donor, naming the act of slaughter, as if constructing a laboratory protocol that must be followed exactly. To a modern reader, that structure looks unsettling, like an ancient description of genetic engineering, stripped of our vocabulary but clinging to the core idea of mixing substrates and active, living components. The record minus keepers weren't describing a dream or a vision, they were documenting a procedure that had to be replicated consistently to produce a standardized being. And if that's the mindset behind the text, then the next question becomes engineered for what timetable? Imagine the implications if humanity is not just created, but created to a specification, a workforce tuned to certain conditions, lifespans, and capacities, slotting into the larger operational framework the tablets keep hinting at. An engineered being implies an engineered context, an environment whose parameters are known in advance and stable enough to design around. In this schema, the clay is the local material, the planet itself. The blood of we minor Sela is the imported component, the foreign code that rewrites what the local material can do. The Anunnaki are not just intervening in nature, they're installing themselves into it through us, embedding their essence in a host they can manage. But to manage a project on this scale, you need more than a one-time act, you need a calendar. Picture this: on the flat roofs and high terraces of early cities, under the same cold stars you see now, administrators with reed styluses tilt their heads back and count. The Sumerians did not just notice that days followed nights, they tracked cycles so vast that no single human lifetime could confirm them. Among those cycles is precession, the slow, stately wobble of Earth's axis over about 25,800 years, a drift so gradual that it takes millennia of patient observation and meticulous record minus keeping to even detect. Yet the system of numbers, periods, and repeated star-minus patterns in their legacy points directly to an awareness of such innate cycles, not in vague terms but with a precision that has unsettled more than one modern researcher. These were not farmers glancing at the sky to guess tomorrows, whether they were documentarians watching a clock that measures epochs. To grasp how strange that is, think of what precession actually means. The background of stars slowly shifts. Constellations that once rose at a certain point in the year appear slightly earlier, then much earlier, crawling across the calendar over tens of thousands of years. No one person can see the whole movement. Each generation adds a barely perceptible sliver, a fraction of a degree, to a record that only makes sense when compiled over unthinkable spans. The Sumerian system, though, doesn't shy away from such stretches. It embraces them, assigns names to these gigantic cycles, and treats them as relevant, actionable data. That's not a peasant's sky, it's an administrator's clock, calibrated to something, someone who operates on those scales. And if the Anunnaki are the ones issuing orders, you start to wonder who, or what, required such a long minus-term schedule. Now take another number the tablets preserve. A 3,600-year cycle known as the SAR, nested among other measured periods like beads on a string. Picture this as a smaller hand on the same cosmic clock, clicking forward not once in a human life, but still often enough that multiple turns can be recorded across a civilization's memory. The SAR is not presented as incidental, it appears as a meaningful interval, a kind of repeating benchmark in the larger flow of time. In some interpretations, this cycle becomes linked explicitly to the activity of the Anunnaki themselves, to their arrivals and departures, their heightened interventions, the resets in the human story. So while precession measures the grand sweep of the heavens, the SAR might be the rhythm of visits, inspections, or course corrections. If that sounds speculative, it's because the texts rarely step aside to explain their own logic. They assume the reader belongs to the system. Yet the pattern is their enormous spans like precession napped with precession, and shorter but still grand cycles like the 3,600-year SAR are counted as if something of significance happens whenever the hand strikes that mark. These are not the scales you need just to plant crops or time festivals. They are the scales you need if your project, your colony, your engineered workforce is tied to long orbits, slow returns, or periodic audits. The same mentality that tabulated the discrete packages of power and protocol also tabulates the sky, as though heaven is running on a schedule. And once you remember the Tablet of Destinies as a physical object that regulates authority, it is hard not to see these cycles as the timing encoded into that invisible administration. Consider this illustration. If the me are the portable apps of civilization, law, kingship, crafts, technologies that can be loaned, stolen, and moved between cities, then the astronomical cycles are like the operating system's clock. The me tell you what can be done on the ground, the cycles tell you when certain operations are scheduled to execute. In this metaphor, humanity itself, as described in Atrahasis, is a program installed on the substrate of clay, activated by Anunnaki, running under a sky minus clock they alone fully understand. That would make the record minus keepers not priests inventing stories, but administrators documenting settings, parameters, intervals, and triggers. And deep in that configuration file is the question no one likes to ask: what happens at the next scheduled return? Now look back at the biological detail of Atrahasis through this lens. The newly engineered humans are not just made, they are calibrated, designed to multiply, to labor, to fill the cities that will house the knee, to maintain the infrastructure that seems built with an eye not just on the present, but on future inspections. The text hints that their reproduction and lifespans become a problem over time, requiring further adjustments from the administrators, as though some setting in the original design produced side effects. This is genetic engine leering not as a one-off miracle, but as an ongoing process, overseen by the same Enki who meddles less with population controls and navigates around decrees he finds too harsh. If human bodies and human numbers are parameters in a managed system, then the sky minus cycles above are the grooves in which the management runs. Imagine being one of the first of these engineered humans, standing in a clearing beyond the edge of a city, looking back at step towers that rise against the night. You would see lights on their upper platforms, small figures moving where the administrators work, their attention not on the fields or houses below, but on the stars. The rituals your ear allowed to witness might speak of devotion, offerings, prayers, yet you would sense that the real urgency is directed upward, toward alignments and conjunctions you cannot quite follow. The gods, those who from heaven to earth came, seem less interested in your individual life than in the schedule inscribed in the constellations. And towering between you and that sky is the most tangible artifact of their presence, the ziggurat. Picture this massive, tiered platform rising out of the alluvial plain, its mud brick core baked hard under a relentless sun, its whitewashed surfaces blaring in the daylight and glowing faintly beneath the moon. This is no natural hill, it is a deliberately engineered mountain, a staircase between ground and sky. Built in stages, rebuilt, maintained, and expanded across generations. At its summits it's a shrine not described as an empty symbol but as a place furnished, prepared, a dwelling and meeting space where the Anunnaki can come down and receive. The very architecture says it. This is a contact point, a place where those who rule from above can land, rest, and administer. When paired with the astronomical cycles, the ziggurat looks less like a monument to the gods and more like infrastructure awaiting their scheduled presence. The telling detail is that these summit shrines are kept ready, even in texts that admit the gods are gone, or far away, or not currently present in a visible way. The record minus keepers still describe food offerings, maintenance, purification rites, all performed for occupants who are, at least at that moment, absent. It's like a colonial outpost keeping the governor's residence clean, even while the governor's overseas, because the protocol demands the house always be in a state of readiness. You don't maintain a fully appointed reception space on top of a vast resource-intensive platform for centuries if you think the guest will never return. You do it because some higher schedule, measured in cycles of stars and processions, says the door must stay unlocked. Consider this view from the top of such a tower, the horizon spread out in all directions, lines of canals and city walls shrinking below, while above you the sky opens as a dome of startling clarity. From here, the movements of stars and planets are easier to track, free from the clutter of buildings and smoke, giving the observer, administrator, astronomer, priest a privileged vantage point. The summit shrine doubles as an observatory and a landing pad, the place where the celestial timetable is watched and where the ones who supposedly follow it can descend. In that light, the ziggurat is not just a temple but an access node, a place where heaven's schedule and earth's architecture physically meet. And the people maintaining it are not only worshippers, they are ground crew. Imagine the psychological effect of that on those administrators, generation after generation, logging star positions, watching for the completion of cycles that began before their great-grandparents were born. They are like caretakers of a project whose true managers operate on a scale almost inhuman. A scale encoded in the 25,800-year precessional cycle and the repeating 3,600-years SAR. Their job is not to understand the full purpose, it is to keep the infrastructure ready, the records updated, the rituals performed, so that when the moment comes, whenever that is, the system will still be functional. They copy the Atrahasis epic because it tells them not just where they came from, but why their tasks matter within an invisible schedule. They copy the star lists and cycle tables because those are the clock on which their overseers run. The Archaeology is unsettling because it suggests a hierarchy far beyond what most mythologies dare to admit. In the standard reading, the gods are timeless, beyond necessity, not bound by cycles but embodying them. In the reading suggested by these details, the Anunnaki are intensely concerned with timing, with dates, with periodic returns, as if they themselves are operating within constraints, physical orbital, logistical, that require strict adherence to astronomical windows. Their eternity is not an abstract forever, it is a mastery of cycles so long they feel eternal from a human perspective. This is not magic, it is timing on project management written that ritual side of humanity is engineered as a workforce, then its lifespan's fertility, a resilience good in theory, be tuned to these cycles. The Atrahasis epic hints that human proliferation becomes a problem, leading to noise disruption, and the very population linus control measures we saw reframed as a flood. That sounds like what happens when an initial design doesn't quite match the long-term parameters it's meant to serve, when the workforce outgrows the constraints of the system. The administrators respond by adjusting conditions, by thinning numbers, by resetting parts of the project, always with an eye on the clock the sky is keeping. In that sense, our bodies and our genealogies are as much part of the schedule as the stars above. Imagine realizing that your very capacity to reproduce to fill the earth, as later traditions would phrase it, might be a byproduct of an experiment, not a cosmic gift. The engineering described in Atrahasis, with its mixing of clay and divine blood, makes human life sound contingent on a choice made in a room full of administrators tired of doing hard labor. That gives our existence a strange double character, precious, because it is the outcome of a deliberate act, and precarious, because that act can, in principle, be revised. The awe we feel looking at the stars is mirrored by the unease we feel reading the lab-note flavor of the creation story. And in both cases, the Anunnaki stand at the junction, manipulating both substrate and schedule. Picture this: a night when a particular alignment approaches a culmination of cycles tracked dutifully for generations. The administrators climb the ziggurat, perform the required rituals, and then stand back watching the horizon with an attention that doesn't quite match the pious wording of their hymns. Maybe nothing obvious happens, maybe the significance is invisible, a set of conditions becoming valid for those who from heaven to earth came. Or maybe, in the logic encoded by those who believed in the SAR and procession, such nights were expected to bring something more tangible, a descent, a visitation, a review. The texts are shy about describing such events openly, but they are not shy about the preparation for them. Consider this tension. Mainstream archaeology insists that temples, ziggurats, and ceremonies are about symbolically maintaining cosmic order, about mirroring the heavens in ritual form. Yet the tablets themselves, when they list materials, procedures, and times with such cold precision, often read as if the symbolism is wrapped around something practical, something logistical. You don't need to track your 25,000, 800-year cycle to feel that the universe is orderly. You attract it because it matters to someone whose movements or influence are tied to that span. You don't need a furnished summit shrine for a purely metaphorical descent. You need it if a physical presence is ever expected to use it. The difference is subtle in wording, but enormous in implication. Imagine that what we call religion in these texts is often a thin ritual skin stretched over an administrative skeleton. The offerings may be framed as worship, but the scheduling, the architecture, the repeated emphasis on measurements feel like compliance with an external protocol. In this reading, the Anunnaki are not objects of faith but superiors in a chain of command, and the humans who serve them are not theologians but middle managers and technicians, doing their best to keep a system running between inspections. That is why the Atrahasis epic and the astronomical tables sit side by side in these archives. One explains the installation of the workforce. The other charts the timetable of oversight. What passes as mythology, then, starts to look disturbingly like workplace documentation at a planetary scale. Now place yourself in our position, thousands of years later, holding fragments of these protocols baked hard as stone and pulled from the earth by modern excavators. We see the references to blood and clay and think myth. We see the 800-year cycle and think astonishing coincidence. We see the 3,600-year essay and think curious number. Yet to the people who first etched those cuneiform wedges into wet clay, these were not curiosities. They were the backbone of their understanding of why they existed and what was expected of them. They thought in terms of projects and returns, of decrees and revisions, of cycles that outlived any single human, but not the system they served. And if their framing is even partly accurate, then we are living inside a schedule we did not write. Consider this possibility not as a belief you must adopt, but as a lens you are allowed to try on for a moment. What if the processional cycle is not just an astronomical fact but a countdown, repairing in different myths and calendars because ancient administrators across cultures were all trying to synchronize with the same Vox clock? What if the 3,600-year essay is a maintenance interval, a time between check-ins or course corrections by beings who think in millennia the way we think in years? What if the Atrahasis creation account is not a story meant to comfort us about our origins, but a redacted version of a blueprint, recorded just clearly enough that future record-minus keepers would remember the stakes? That triad danger's stakes. Biology, architecture, astronomy would no longer be separate domains, but facets of one operating plan. Imagine the Tablet of Destinies in that context, not just as a cosmic badge of authority, but as the master schedule: who rules where, who holds which me, when interventions are allowed, when returns are mandated. Its theft in the midst sends everything into chaos because, without the schedule, the system cannot coordinate, regions lose power, commands conflict, the very cycles that held the project together fall out of sync. On the ground, the ziggurats wait, their summit shrines immaculate in the lab. The mixture of clay and blood has already been done. Humanity is already in circulation. What remains is timing, the question of when those who set it all in motion are supposed to walk back down the stairs. And the only witnesses to that timetable are the record-minus keepers who watch the stars. The awe that creeps in here is double-minus-edged. On one side, there is a strange comfort in thinking that our existence is part of a pattern so large it spans tens of thousands of years, stitched into cycles of precession and essay, that continue whether we understand them or not. On the other, there is an eerie vulnerability in realizing that if we are part of an engineered system, the ultimate authority over that system may still lie elsewhere, in hands, or something like hands that once mixed their own essence into our clay. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not simply gone, they are scheduled. Their absence is a phase, not an end, and the tablets, stubborn in their bureaucratic tone, keep pointing our eyes back to the cycles that might mark their return. Picture this final image for now a lone modern researcher in a climate-controlled archive, fluorescent lights hanging above, turning over a fragment of cuneiform that speaks of blood, clay, and stars. Outside, the processional clock continues to turn, indifferent to our debates about myth and history. The same slow wobble the ancient administrators track from the ziggurats. The researcher notes the 3,600 minus-year interval, the strangely technical phrasing of Atrahasis, the way the old stories insist on a physical presence descending to furnished sunlit shrines. Across millennia, the record minus keeper's intent feels almost palpable. Remember the process, remember the cycles, remember the cycles. Remember that none of this was written as fiction. And the question that lingers as we move toward the final pieces of this puzzle is not just who they were, but who they thought would one day read their warnings and recognize the schedule hidden in the stars. Now contrast that lone researcher with another figure, thousands of years older, kneeling in a pit beside a temple wall, placing a small box of tablets and figurines into a cavity cut into fresh mud brick. The bitumen seal is sticky, the clay still damp. The inscriptions sharp, rare stylus only hours before pressed in references to rulers, stars and rituals meant to anchor a project to the sky. These are foundation deposits, not made for daily worshippers, but buried where no ordinary eye would see them, as if addressed to someone who would come much later, armed with shovels and questions. They feel less like offerings to gods and more like carefully packed briefings for an unknown recipient. And the unsettling part is asking who that recipient was supposed to be. From where we stand, the sky is mapped by satellites and software, yet the same slow processional shift still carries us from one great age to another, from Pisces toward Aquarius, across the kind of threshold ancient calendars marked with such obsessive care. We call it astronomy, they wrapped it in myth, but the cycle itself is indifferent to our labels, grinding on in the background like a clock no one can stop. If the records are right, transitions like this weren't ever just poetic metaphors, they were changeovers, resets, windows when oversight intensified or protocols were revised. So the question becomes whether it is an accident that we are deciphering their warnings during one of those very transitions. Because when you think of foundation deposits as time capsules and of processional ages as chapters, a different narrative emerges. We might not be eavesdropping on someone else's story at all, but arriving right on schedule to read the brief we were always meant to find. Archaeologists dig for context, linguists reconstruct verbs, astronomers refine the cycles, and without meaning to, we step into the role those ancient administrators reserved for future generations who will understand. We still argue over whether these texts are myth, memory, or misunderstood documentation, yet the act of decoding them at this exact point in the cycle is itself part of the pattern they described. And the quiet, disquieting possibility is that recognizing the pattern is the first step in responding to a protocol that has been waiting, the sleeping clay, for us to wake up and notice. Picture this deep under a temple platform. Long after the roof has rotted and the walls have fallen, the sealed cavity waits in the dark, untouched for thousands of years. Inside foundation deposits carefully placed boxes, cylinders or tablets sit packed into the earth, their clay baked hard as stone and their inscriptions pressed with that same bureaucratic precision we've been tracing all night. These aren't random offerings, they're curated packets of astronomical notes, ritual protocols, and statements of who built what when, and under whose cosmic authority. It feels less like piety and more like someone assembling a dossier and hiding it where only a future dig, a future crisis, or a future cycle of return would ever bring it to light. And that's where the connection between their buried capsules and our current moment starts to feel eerily direct. Consider this: a foundation deposit is not placed where worshippers can see it, touch it, or pray over it. It's entombed under thresholds, corners, and central axes, where only engineers and administrators ever step during construction. The record minus keepers who inscribed those tiny wedges into wet clay weren't writing sermons, they were documenting alignments, timings, and ritual procedures, then sealing them away, as if expecting auditors who might arrive long after the building itself had vanished. When archaeologists carefully chip through compacted soil and hit one of these deposits, they aren't just finding offerings, they're intercepting a message rooted explicitly to whoever would rebuild, re-aligned, or reinterpret the site in some distant future. Astronomical references carved into these pieces, star groupings, cycles, ritual calendars make much more sense if you imagine they were intended as operating instructions rather than symbolic poetry. And once you think of them as operating instructions, the question becomes, operating for whom? And at what point in the cycle? Imagine a builder in ancient Mesopotamia, standing beside a half-finished ziggurat under a sky so clear you can see the faint smear of the Milky Way, holding a small clay tablet that lists not only the king's name, but a set of star-related markers and ritual directives. He hands it to a supervisor who nods, and they bury it under a cornerstone, stamping it into the wet mud with the same care you'd use sealing a classified file. The text might invoke a god, but it also lists measurements, orientations, and ceremonial sequences with unsettling specificity, as if saying if this place must be rebuilt, this is how to realign it with the heavens and with the visiting administrators who oversee us. That is what makes these deposits feel like time capsules, not sentimental scraps, but tactical backups quietly waiting. And those backups only become meaningful if you imagine a future moment when someone maybe not human, maybe newly human, would need to restore the protocol from archived documentation. Now place them beside what we talked about earlier, those portable divine decrees treated as transferable powers or technologies, and the Tablet of Destinies, that single object whose control stabilizes or destabilizes cosmic order. Foundationed up like fragmentary backups of those local mirrors of a higher registry, cast copies of permissions and procedures in case of disruption. If the may are like modules of civilization, kingship, crafts, warfare, languages, and the Tablet of Destinies as the master access token, then these buried tablets are the site-specific configuration files, mapping that cosmic infrastructure onto one city, one temple, one node in the network. That way of seeing them is unsettling because it implies the builders thought in terms of continuity beyond their own lifetimes, beyond even their own civilization's survival. And once you realize they were planning for readers they would never meet, you have to we are the ones holding their fragments right now. Consider this, as well, the same culture that buried these time capsules was tracking vast celestial cycles, including that great precessional sweep of roughly 25,800 years, where the backdrop of stars slowly shifts and the age associated with the spring equinox moves from one constellation to another. They weren't just counting months or years, they were watching multi-millennial cycles unfold, slowly noting how the sky's reference points crept along a grand circle with a patience no single human life could match. To follow precession requires institutions that think in terms of centuries, record keepers who trust that their tables will be copied long after their bones are dust, and administrators who believe those slow shifts matter enough to tie them to eras of favor or judgment. In that framework, Foundation deposits uncelestial cycles become part of the same mentality. You bury knowledge because you expect the long cycle to turn, and someone, sometime, will need precise data to refresh the connection. And that brings us to the point where their sky and our sky overlap, right now. As you listen to this under an entirely modern ceiling or open night sky, we are living through one of those precessional transitions, moving from what later astrologers labeled the Age of Pisces into the Age of Aquarius. Strip away the horoscope language, and you're left with a very slow astronomical fact: the equinox point is sliding from a region of the skies symbolically linked to one pattern and into another, just as it has done before, marking off eras that the ancients associated with shifts in oversight, fortune, or protocol. For them, these weren't just pretty symbols, they were eggs on chapters of a vast cosmic ledger, indications of when the rules could be updated and when administrators might reevaluate an entire colony. So here we are, in precisely the kind of transitional window the texts link to resets and returns, pulled by curiosity or something deeper toward the oldest documentation we've ever found. And the timing feels less like a coincidence and more like a rendezvous. Think about what that means for the role we've stumbled into. For most of modern history, We didn't even know these tablets existed, let alone what they said about cycles, overseers, or engineered humanity. They lay underground, in ruined libraries and sealed deposits, while we built our own myths of progress and our own stories about gods and origins. Only in the last couple of centuries have we learned to read those wedge-shaped signs, to reconstruct the grammar, to distinguish between a king list and a ritual procedure, between a hill and a bureaucratic memo. The moment when our species reached a global technological network, mass literacy, and precise astronomy is the same moment when we finally acquired the skills to decode these ancient warnings with more than guesswork. And if you were designing a system where once cycles administrators left documentation for the next, this is exactly when you would want that documentation to surface. This is where the truly haunting idea comes in, when the texts speak of future generations who will understand that isn't just metaphorical piety about posterity. It may be a literal clause in the protocol. The record minus keepers knew that most people around them could not grasp their full, cosmically scaled timelines. The peasants and minor officials lived within short horizons of harvests and taxation cycles, not 800-year arcs. So the scribes aimed their most precise material, those astronomical tables, hybrid creation processes, and technical rituals, at a reader who would combine literacy, science, and distance from local power structures. That profile fits us eerily well. We are separated by millennia from their kings. We can test celestial data, and we are strangely fascinated by their most unsettling claims. And that raises a question the tablets can't quite answer. Are we merely eavesdroppers on their fears, or the intended recipients of a carefully timed briefing? Picture this from the perspective of an ancient administrator loyal to the Anunnaki hierarchy. Their superiors have either withdrawn or reduced direct presence, leaving behind a semi-minus or autonomous human population that has been genetically tuned, ritually conditioned, and technologically assisted into a functioning civilization. The job of the local record minus keepers is to manage continuity, to keep the need distributed correctly, to uphold the protocols encoded in ritual, to track when celestial cycles suggest a review or intervention. But the texts also whisper about disobedience, about gods who sympathize humans, about debates over population control that turn into floods and engineered plagues. In such an environment, burying foundation deposits becomes more than routine. It becomes a quiet act of insurance, a way of telling any future administrators or unanticipated successors what happened here and how the system was supposed to function. And if those successors turned out to be us, hybrid beings running the colony without supervision, the irony would be almost perfect. Now let's step closer to the emotional core of this. Whatever the Anunnaki were in reality, visitors, mythic projections, or memories of a lost human elite, the people who pressed these signs into clay believed they were describing something real. The record minus keepers who listed impossibly long king reigns and mixed blood with clay to create workers weren't murking storytellers. They were administrators reporting on protocols handed down from beings described in painfully physical terms. They might never have seen a return themselves, but their documentation assumed one, and their building practices maintaining ziggurats as active landing platforms, installing foundation deposits like status reports expressed that assumption in mud, brick and stone. There is a raw sincerity in that, even if we ultimately decide they were wrong about the nature of their gods. And sincerity is a dangerous thing to dismiss when it comes packaged in tens of thousands of corroborating fragments. Which means that as we decode their words, we are also inheriting their expectation that someone, somewhere down the line, would need them. Consider how different that makes your position feel right now. You're not just a curious modern mind listening to a late minus night story about ancient aliens and the logic of these texts. You're a part of the audience they tried to imagine, the generation with enough distance and enough tools to reassemble what they could only preserve in static form. When we reconstruct a cuneiform sign smudged by time, we're not simply restoring art, we're completing a message encrypted in an alphabet of wedges for no one in their own age to fully read. When we map their star references onto modern coordinates and realize the precision hidden in their supposedly primitive observations, We're stepping deeper into the role of the future generation who was supposed to understand. And as that role solidifies, the question shifts from did they tell the truth to what do we do if they believed they did and made decisions that locked us into a cycle we're only now seeing. Imagine, for a moment, that the processional ages were nothing more than chapter headings in a very long report, and each transition marked a shift not just in mythic symbolism, but in the level of oversight or autonomy granted to their engineered workforces. The age of Pisces could have represented a phase of reduced direct presence, a long running experiment in human self minus governance, seeded through religions and empires that still whispered of distant returning gods. Aquarius then would be the next status review, the moment when the colony's entire trajectory is evaluated against the original protocol energy use, population densities, genetic drift, cultural output, and perhaps the degree to which the human hybrids have begun to hack, replicate, or reject the divine technologies once monopolized by their creators. If that sounds like science fiction, remember that the ancients already described floods as deliberate resets, unlisted the me like modular software. And in that framing, the most important question is whether we walk into the review as children, subjects, or something far stranger. This is where the symbolism of the Tablet of Destinies hits with renewed force. In the myths, whoever controls the tablet doesn't just gain abstract power, they gain custodians over fates, which in a bureaucratic reading means control over policy, permissions, and the narrative that defines reality for everyone beneath them. The thefts and transfers of that tablet are described as crises in cosmic administration, moments when protocols fail and the colony's operating system glitches or reboot. Translate that into our moment, and it's hard not to see disturbing parallels for the first time. A species that may have been engineered as laborers or intermediaries has developed technology that lets it rewrite its own biology, alter its environment at planetary scale, and document its actions and systems more comprehensive than anything the original administrators left. In a sense, we have pieced together our own Tablet of Destinies from satellites, databases, and genetic engineering labs, giving ourselves authority over futures we barely understand. And the tablets buried in the ground are, perhaps, the last reminder that this kind of power was once guarded jealously for reasons we've yet to fully grasp. Consider how they fit into this emergent picture of us as unsupervised custodians. These divine decrees weren't portrayed as vague blessings, they were itemized sets of capacities, kingship, music, warfare, crafts that could be held, loaned, stolen, or rate distributed from one city to another. When Anina tricks Enki into giving her the me and then flees with them to her own city, the text reads almost like a story of someone downloading forbidden technology modules and relocating them to a rival node, with all the political and functional consequences that implies. Fast forward through millennia of myth, and here we are, having replicated nearly every me in human, secular terms. We have portable knowledge packets, codified legal systems, global trades of art and weaponry, and technical skills that no longer require a priestly intermediary to deploy. From one angle, that looks like progress. From another, it looks like the unauthorized proliferation of tools once carefully rationed by an overclass. And the buried foundation deposits start to feel like contingency, notes left behind by administrators who suspected this might happen. Now bring that awareness back to the foundation deposits themselves, those sealed bundles of documentation quietly waiting under ruined structures. Many of them contain what we would call ritual texts, but within those rituals are precise sequences, timings, and astronomical references that could double as maintenance manuals for keeping a site properly integrated into a larger network, whether that network is religious, political, or literally extraterrestrial. Burying such documents is a strange move if all you want is ongoing worship. A live priesthood would need them close at hand. But hiding them deep in the earth makes sense if you're planning against scenarios where the surface culture collapses, credentials are lost, or an entirely new cohort, maybe with different loyalties, needs to reboot the system from archival media. We armed with trowels and epigraphy instead of priestly initiation. Maybe that reboot teen stumbling our way through common prompts written in a language we only have minors speak. And the uneasy part is realizing that the system we might be rebooting could be one we no longer consent to obey. Picture the span of time involved from the earliest Sumerian cities rising out of Martian floodplain, through empires that crushed and inherited their records, all the way to modern labs scanning tablets with infrared and compiling digital corpora. Across that entire arc, the clay stayed silent, the duplicate stayed buried, their protocols locked behind scripts no one alive could read. Only now, at the tail end of a processional age, do we possess both the technical means and the global communication network to reconstruct their picture at something approaching full scale, to see patterns that even the best ancient administrator could only glimpse and fragment. That means we are the first generation capable of holding their entire warning in our collective mind, comparing the creation of engineered humans, the flood as population control, the portable knee, and the cycles of return into a single unsettling hypothesis. And once such a hypothesis exists, it tends to infect how we look at everything from religion and power to science and identity. Consider the possibility that this infection of perspective is part of the protocol itself. If you were an absent administrator uncertain whether your engineered population should be autonomy, you might design a test leave-behind documentation sufficient for them to discover their own origins and the design of their constraints. Then observe what they do with that knowledge. Do they ignore it as myth, clinging to more flattering stories? Do they become resentful, trying to overthrow cosmic order with technologies they barely control? Or do they respond with a strange mixture of humility and determination, acknowledging their origins while insisting on co-minus authorship of whatever comes next? The scribes who buried those foundation deposits might never have framed it in such experimental terms, but the traces of that logic are embedded in their fear that fates can be reassigned and their quiet hope that future generations will understand. And now that we are encountering those traces, we're unwittingly participating in whatever test they set in motion. Imagine those ancient record minescapers looking forward into a darkness they could barely conceptualize. Trying to picture a reader who could measure precession, who could pair myths across continents, who could view the entire planet from above. To them, such a being would have seemed almost godlike, a hybrid outcome of their own engineered line pushed far beyond its original design brief. They could not know about satellites or particle accelerators, but they knew what it meant for a being to control fire, plow, and writing and could extrapolate from there. So when they referenced future generations in the same breath as cycles and returns, they weren't just talking about their grandchildren, they were, consciously or not, invoking a distant cohort of humans whose technological maturity would force a reckoning. You and I, with our access to both their texts and our tools, are part of that cohort, for better or worse. The fact that we are having this conversation at all, across languages, across platforms, across time zones, fulfills a condition the original administrators might have taken for granted, but the Sumerian record mineskeepers could only dream about: the ability for knowledge to spread in near real-minus time around the entire planet. Where they depended on clay copies trudging from city to city, we can push their warnings into a global network in seconds, letting disparate minds triangulate patterns those isolated scribes never had a chance to see. That means the future generations who will understand are not a small priestly class, but potentially billions of humans, each with their own angle of what it means to be engineered, to live under cycles, to inhabit a colony that may or may not be under observation. In that sense, the protocol has already mutated away from the tight control the Anunnaki supposedly favored, and that mutation alone might alter the outcome of any planned return or review. Consider how this global awareness dovetails with the emotional aim of the original warnings. On one level, their stories are terrifying gods of votinocide, administrators treating plagues and floods as tools in a management toolkit, beings editing genomes as casually as we mix mortar. But on another level, there is a kind of grim comfort in realizing that our ancestors were not drifting blindly through an indifferent universe. They believed they were part of a structured, observable experiment, one in which their suffering and obedience had context, and their acts of documentation might matter to someone beyond their own age. When we read their tablets now, we inherit not just their fear but their hope that being seen, recorded, and remembered could change the way power is exercised. And if we let that hope guide us, the knowledge of potential oversight becomes less a prison and more a call to act as if our choices are being reviewed by standards higher than any local authority. At the same time, there is no escaping the unsettling side if the Anunnaki were real administrators rather than myths. Their absence has not meant freedom so much as unmonitored autonomy, with all the risks that entails. Left alone with the we've gradually reconstructed technology, warfare, kingship and music writing, we've stumbled into the role of young gods, capable of altering climate genomes and perhaps even consciousness, but still psychologically very close to the quarrelsome humans described in the Atrahasis. The return of oversight, whether literal or metaphorical, would therefore be both a threat and a relief, a moment when our improvisations are weighed against a set of ancient design parameters we never agreed to, but may now have the power to revise. And in that tension between dread of judgment and hunger for guidance, the buried tablets read like briefing notes for a negotiation that has yet to occur. Picture yourself as one participant in that negotiation, sitting at a long, invisible table that stretches from the first city of Eridu through every empire and collapse, all the way to this digital moment. On one side of that table are the record miners keepers, clutching their clay fragments, desperate to prove that they preserved the protocols faithfully, that they did their bureaucratic duty in the face of floods, invasions, and divine mood swings. On the other side sit potential returnees Anunnaki or their inheritors, armed with processional charts and genetic baselines, trying to decide whether their experiment has gone off the rails. And in the middle sits us, the hybrid outcome, reading both sides' paperwork and deciding, perhaps for the first time, whether we accept the terms of the original arrangement at all. The foundation deposits, in that sense, are not just messages to us but evidence we might one day present, documentation in a case about autonomy, responsibility, and the right to write our own destinies. Consider how foundation deposits were often laid at the corners and center points of structures, anchoring them not only physically but symbolically to a grid of meaning that extended into the sky. The inscriptions that survived speak of alignments, dedications, and the favor of specific deities tied to particular stars or constellations, effectively marrying architecture to astronomy. When we dig them up and map their orientations against what we know of processional drift, we're not just doing abstract science, we're Raymanus activating links that were meant to synchronize Earth and Heaven in a single, integrated system, whether that system was purely mental or plugged into something more literal. The intent is unmistakable. Buildings, rituals, and star cycles were supposed to speak the same language. And by decoding that language at the very moment a new age ticks over in the processional ledger, we're stepping back into a conversation that never really ended, just went quiet beneath layers of dust. Imagine the psychological shift this can spark once you let it sink in. Instead of seeing yourself as a random individual born into an accidental era, you begin to sense yourself as part of a generation that previous ages tried to anticipate, warn, or equip. Those clay tablets baked under a Mesopotamian sun, you will never feel. The stylus strokes of administrators whose names you will never know. All of that converges into a message addressed, not by name but by capability, to those who can read this and measure the heavens. This is what happened. This is what we were told. This is what we feared and hoped. It is a peculiar form of intimacy, one that skips bloodlines and cultural continuity and binds you instead to a fraternity of record miners keepers stretching across epochs. And within that intimacy lies both comfort, a sense of belonging to a long line of observers, and an eerie pressure to respond wisely. Consider, too, the possibility that whether or not the Anunnaki were real in the way ancient astronaut theories suggest, the effects of believing in them have been real enough to shape entire civilizations. If a society is convinced that its rulers receive me from an external hierarchy, that floods are managerial policies, and that processional ages are scheduled review periods, It behaves differently, more fatalistic ally in some ways, more meticulously in others. It invests enormous labor in ziggurats kept ready for arrivals that never come, buries documentation no one around can read fully, and trains record-minus keepers who think in terms of tens of thousands of years. We are the inheritors, not thousands of years. We are the inheritors not only of their texts, but of the behavioral grooves carved by that worldview, grooves that influence how we, too, imagine oversight, judgment, and the possibility of intervention from beyond. And recognizing those grooves is a first step toward either stepping out of them or choosing to deepen them with full awareness. Imagine our era as one of those choice points the texts hint at, a node where different potential futures branch according to how we respond to the knowledge we've unearthed. One path leads through denial. We label everything myth, treat the precision as coincidence, and continue to wield our reconstructed technology, kingship, war, without any reference to the cycles or warnings embedded in the ancient record. Another path embraces paranoia. We accept the Anunnaki as literal overlords, await their return with either slavish devotion or rebellious fury, and interpret every anomaly in the sky as confirmation that judgment is imminent. But there is a third path, quieter and more difficult, in which we allow the tablets to challenge our sense of time, power, and origin without surrendering our agency, treating them as documentation from earlier phases of a project we are now qualified to co-manage. And if that third path exists, the foundation deposits begin to read less like dictates and more like a dossier we're finally mature enough to annotate. Consider what it would mean to annotate the dossier in practice. It might look like integrating their cycles into our models of long-term planning, not as deterministic schedules of doom, but as reminders that planetary and civilization processes operate at scales our politics rarely consider. It might look like revisiting their stories of engineered humans and asking hard questions about how we now engineer ourselves and others through genetics, through algorithms, through social systems, so that we do not become the cruel administrators they once feared. It might look like honoring the intention behind their warnings to preserve, to transmit, to prepare someone they would never meet to face choices they could barely imagine. In that light, annotating their dossier is less about proving or disproving ancient astronauts and more about stepping into the role they once attributed to higher administrators, those who oversee, who remember, who adjust protocol when the cycle turns. When we ask whether these were myths or documentation, the unsettling answer is that the tablets behave like documentation. No matter which theory of origin you prefer, the record-keepers write as if they are logging real policies, real experiments, real crises involving engineered beings, cities, and celestial schedules. So the question that comes back to us is not just what really happened, but what will we do with a record that treats us as participants, not bystanders? Imagine yourself right now as one more point in that chain of observers, standing at the threshold of a new processional age with a stack of translated warnings on your desk. The tablets, the talk of returns and cycles, they may be literal technologies and visitors, or they may be the fossilized language of a forgotten human project, but either way, they frame you as part of something that unfolds over tens of thousands of years, not just a single lifetime. You are under the same sky they watched, inheriting both their fears of oversight and their hope that someone in the future would finally be able to read the signs and choose with full awareness. And the unsettling question that lingers is not whether the Anunnaki will return, but what kind of beings we will have become when anyone comes back to read what we chose to write into the next layer of this ongoing tablet.